All right, and this video is on the population genetics worksheet, so we'll put our name on at the top. So remember that frequencies P plus Q adds up to 1, or big A, the frequency of big A plus the frequency of little a add up to 1. And then remember to find the genotypic frequencies, we basically square both sides of that equation. So that's where we get from the FOIL method, we get P squared plus 2pq plus q squared is equal to 1. And that's the genotypic formula. And so we have to go back and forth between these two formulas. So we'll start with this first question. Imagine there's a gene for which there are two alleles, big A, little a. If I know the frequency of big A is 0.35, what is the frequency of little a? And so this goes to our formula. The frequency of one plus the frequency of the other is equal to 1. And so if I know the frequency of big A is 0.35, then I know the frequency of little a has to be 0.65 because those two numbers add up to 1. So that's 0.65. That just tells us the allele frequency. The next question is asking you to calculate genotypic frequency. So I'm giving you P plus Q. I'm giving you big A plus little a. I'm giving that to you. But now you need to figure out what the genotypic frequencies are. So big A is calculated by taking the frequency of A and squaring it. So 0.4 squared is equal to the frequency of big A, which is equal to 0.16. Okay. The frequency of the heterozygotes is 2 times the frequency of A times the frequency of little a is equal to the heterozygotes, right? That's the 2pq. And so that's equal to, well, you get 0.24 times 2 is 0.48. And then finally, the last genotype is figured out by saying, okay, it's the little a squared. So 0.6 squared is equal to the frequency of little a, and that's 0.36. Now you can always check your work and make sure that these allele frequencies are going to add up to 1. So 0.16 plus 0.48 is equal to 0.64. 0.64 plus 0.36 is equal to 1. All right, but this question is asking me something different. It said if there's 100 people, how many would I expect to find of each genotype? Well, 16% of the 100 are going to be the homozygous dominant genotype. So 16 times 100 is just 16. The heterozygous ones would be 48% of 100, which is just 48. And then the homozygous recessive would be 36% of the 100 people would have that genotype. And so that would be 36. Okay. Next question. Suppose I count all the genotypes and I end up with these numbers. Big A is 0.48, big A is 0.52, and then I give you the little a is 6.5. Okay. What are the allele frequencies of big A and little a? Well, we can do this a number of different ways, right? So if I can kind of write these out so they're all next to each other. So I have 48 of these individuals, 52 of those individuals, and 65 of those individuals. So what I need to do is count my total number of alleles. So I can do this a couple of different ways. The first way I can do it is I can say each one of these that are being counted represent one individual, and one individual is going to have 2 alleles each. So I'm just going to add these up. I'm going to say 8 plus 2 is 10, plus 5 is 15. So 5, 1, 4 plus 1 is 5, that's 10, 16. So I end up with 165 people in my study. Okay, so I know that 165 people, if I multiply that number by 2, that's going to give me 330 alleles. So the frequency of big A is going to equal the frequency at which A appears, right? So the number of A alleles out of the 330 total. So let's figure out how many of the total alleles, which is 330, are of the big A type. Well, we know that 48 individuals are going to have 2 alleles each. So just double that number. That tells us how many of these individuals, or how many big A alleles are in these individuals. So 48 times 2 is, 90 96, right? So that's 96. But that's not all the big A's, right? These individuals have some too. So 96. But these individuals only have one big A per individual. So 96 plus 52 is going to give us the frequency of big A. Now, we could stop here and just solve that and then subtract the answer of that from 1, and that will give us the frequency of the other allele, right? But let's just, for fun, let's just figure it out mathematically. So again, we calculated the total number of alleles. We counted up the number of individuals. The number of individuals was 165. Each individual carries 2 alleles, so there's a total of 330 total alleles in this population. How many of them are the little a type? Well, we know that 65 of them have 2 of the little a alleles each. So that's 130, I'm multiplying that by 2, 130 little a alleles come from these homozygous recessives. Now back up here, that's not the only little a's. The heterozygotes are also carrying 1 little a each. So there's 52 little a's there. So 130 plus 52, and that equals the frequency of little a. And so now you can figure that out yourself. Go ahead and do that. I don't have a calculator on me, otherwise I'd do it. So just add 96 plus 52, divide that by 330. That should give you a frequency. Same thing here, 130 plus 52 divided by 330. That'll give you the frequency of the other. Those two frequencies should add up to 1. Like these two fractions, if you add them together, should add up to 1, because that includes all individuals from that population. So I'm not giving you the answer there, right? You're going to have to calculate that on your own. Imagine a gene where P is dominant, Q is recessive. The allele frequency of Q is 0.4. What would be my expected frequency of homozygous recessive phenotypes in this population? Okay, well, if the allele of Q is 0.4, so we'll go Q is 0.4, that means that P has to be 0.6. Okay, I'm just writing that down for fun. But it's not asking me anything about P, it's just saying what's my expected frequency of homozygous recessive phenotypes. So I have the frequency of Q, that's the recessive allele. And in order to calculate what the percentage of homozygous individuals are going to be, I would have to take Q squared, right? What's the probability that I pull a Q out twice? So if I flip a coin and I have a 40% chance of it landing on heads, what's the probability that it lands on heads twice? 2 flips. Okay, so you would square that number. So to figure that out, the question is asking what is Q squared? Well, Q squared is just 0.4 squared. And the answer to that is 0.16. So 16% of my population should be homozygous recessive if this is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and if the frequency of Q is 0.4. Okay, next page. All right. This one says, in a population, the frequency of homozygous recessive individuals is 0.64. Now it's asking me what's the frequency of the P allele. So look at this. I'm giving you Q squared is 0.64. It's saying what's the frequency of P? Well, to figure that out, right, I say, okay, if 64% of my individuals in my population are homozygous recessive, then I can take the square root of both sides, and that gives me Q is 0.8. If Q is 0.8, P has to be 0.2, because they have to add up to 1. Now it's asking me what the frequency of the P is. Well, that's 0.2. That's simple. All right, this next question is related to this previous one, except I'm asking you to figure this part out yourself, what the Q squared is. So I say, okay, there's a gene with 2 alleles, P and Q. P is dominant, codes for brown hair. Q is recessive, codes for blonde hair. Okay, I count 100 people, and I notice how many people have each phenotype. Okay, so 91 out of 100 people, right, are either P squared or heterozygous, right? Because P is dominant, right? So if I'm counting brown-haired people, 91 out of 100 of them have brown hair. But some of them are going to be heterozygous and some of them are going to be homozygous dominant. So I don't know which one is which. But I do know that 9 out of 100 is equal to Q squared. And 9 out of 100 is 0. Shoot, what am I doing? Is that right? 9 out of 100. divided by 100 is 0.9 there, is equal to Q. So if I take, no, 0.9 is, sorry guys, this number can be reduced down to 0.09, because that's 9 out of 100, right? 0.09 is equal to Q squared. 9 out of 100 is the same thing as 0.09. So when I take the square root of both sides, I should end up with Q is equal to 0.3, right? And the way you can do this is square roots and square, and is just, they're inverses of each other. So if I square 0.3, do I get 0.9? Yes. Okay, then I know Q is 0.3, which means P has to be 0.7, right? Because P and Q have to add up to each other. And so now what this is asking me, it's saying, okay, fill out the table. Well, we know that the frequency of P is 0.7. Frequency of Q has to add up to 1, 0.3. And now I can say, right, based on my data, let's fill out the following tables. Based on my data, what do I think or expect the frequency of homozygous dominant phenotypes to be? Well, that's just P squared is right here. So we just take 0.7 squared, that's 0.49. Okay, and they have brown hair. 2PQ, all right, well, I take 0.7 times 0.3, and I get 0.21, so that's PQ, times 2 would be 0.42. All right, add those two numbers together, and guess what you get? You get 0.91, right? And then this last one, we already figured this out, it's 0.9, right? That was up here. And if you notice, all these frequencies add up to 1. This individual has brown hair, and these individuals have blonde hair. Okay. All right, and that is it.